Independent study proposal for prospectus topic. American Marxist thought, action and responses to the crises of Cold War-era socialist states. The term communism, like most political terms, carries a dictionary definition which describes its aims and ideals. However, coexisting with the dictionary term is a geopolitical reality in which said concept becomes defined by the sometimes less than ideal actions of communist governments which justify state interests under an ideological banner. The aim of this project is to examine how American Marxists, intellectuals, political parties, and their rank and file, during the mid to late Cold War period, 1968 to 1991, responded to the crises faced internationally by governments and foreign political movements which define themselves as Marxist, namely Vietnam, China, the Soviet Union, and Latin American countries such as Nicaragua. The framing of this project is designed to encompass periods during the Cold War when radical socialist states and movements were facing major crises, due either to foreign invasion, such as the Vietnam War, or self-imposed social, economic, and humanitarian failures. American Marxists, and by extension much of the radical left, often dealt with three major issues in terms of their political and intellectual conduct. These were the debate over a vision of socialism with relation to the major established communist governments, such as the Soviet Union or People's Republic of China, a critique of U.S. policy and strategies concerning how to advance their visions of an American socialist society on the path to communism. In terms of identifying a historical problem, this project seeks to discover the significance of traditional Marxism, ranging from the first to fourth socialist international worldview as well as Maoism, during the mid to late Cold War in the United States. In a recent interview I conducted with Noam Chomsky, he recounted his visit to North Vietnam during a bombing halt. After giving a lecture at the Polytechnic Institute, he was taken by government officials to a movie commemorating the death of Ho Chi Minh. As foreign dignitaries approached to pay tribute to the North Vietnamese leader, Chomsky's translator tapped him on the shoulder and pointed out that the man approaching the podium was the head of the American peace movement. Chomsky was amused when he recognized the man was Gus Hall, the
head of the Communist Party USA.
The novelty of this anecdote stems from the reality that few in the U.S. would have identified Gus Hall as the head of the American peace movement. However, this story begs the question, what were Gus Hall and the CPUSA, Communist Party USA, doing during this period in order to be identified with this noteworthy accolade? During the mid to late Cold War period, the communist parties in Western European countries, such as Italy and France, garnered attention and electoral significance in regions of both countries. Historians have studied the role the CPUSA played in the early 20th century, as well as the New Left's activism throughout the 1960s and 70s. However, the thought, activism, and alliances forged by the traditional Marxists in the United States throughout the mid to late Cold War remains academically neglected, despite the fact that at both elite and grassroots levels, there were debates over the influence, strategies, and significance of traditional Marxist worldviews in the United States throughout that time period. How did traditional Marxism define itself, strategize, and interact with a sympathetic spectrum of voices with similar political concerns, such as the New Left and progressive religious groups concerned with Latin American political autonomy? What goals did traditional Marxism have for the United States? How did current events in foreign socialist countries affect traditional Marxist ideological determination? These are the questions that this project aims to answer. For prospective source space of this project, I aim to utilize personal papers, publications, and academic writings and conduct oral history where possible with the intellectuals of Cold War-era traditional Marxism. In addition, I plan to examine archival data of American radical traditional Marxist parties, such as the CPUSA, Socialist Workers' Party, and Maoist groups, such as the Progressive Labor Party and Revolutionary Communist Party. Furthermore, radical newspapers, speeches, and published writings can also be a source for the shifting worldview and propagandistic methodologies of the traditional Marxists during the mid to late Cold War in the United States. Where possible, oral history can be conducted with rank-and-file members of American radical political parties, as well as with those sympathetic to traditional Marxist radical political aims during the Cold War. I plan to examine responses of American traditional Marxists to crises in Vietnam, mainland China, and Latin America. In doing so, I will see the continuity and changes in the thought and action of traditional Marxism through the 1960s to 1980s. The Vietnam War bears special significance for the United States during the Cold War. In the seemingly stable post-World War II period, a platform for dissent against the American way was now open for radical voices, including those of traditional Marxism, because of this war. While the New Left was a phenomenon noted for its numbers, plurality of voices, and diversity of agendas, traditional Marxists provided a disciplined political structure and analytical platform that was able to be understood within the context of traditional politics. Television programs such as William F. Buckley's Firing Line hosted traditional Marxist voices, such as Noam Chomsky and Fred Halstead, U.S. presidential candidate of the Socialist Workers' Party. Their voices provided a critique of conventional American foreign and domestic policies. While traditional Marxism often meant Bolshevik, as noted by Noam Chomsky, ideologies of old-school pre-Leninist Marxism, in some cases, predated Bolshevism. For example, Chomsky's libertarian socialist worldview predated the New Left movements of the 1960s and had roots in the political thought of late 19th and early 20th century Europe. It is within the context of the Vietnam War that traditional Marxist voices, such as Noam Chomsky and the leaders of American Bolshevik political parties, were able to gain a public platform and interact with the New Left in criticizing both American foreign policy and the mainstream vision for United States society. The Soviet Union had long presented a traditional political brand for traditional Marxism. However, some previously old-school Marxist activists, who had begun to see the shortcomings in the Soviet political model, but still found merit in the ethics of Marxist political theory, were enthusiastic to embrace other models of Marxist political experiments. Maoist China presented such an alternative. Marxism. Leninism often remained a core tenet of Maoist thought. The anti-authority currents within Maoist ideology, which embrace Marxism. Leninism, while questioning the legitimacy of those in power, appealed to members of traditional Marxist ideology during a time when the anti-authoritarian currents of the New Left were part of the political and social environment of the mid-Cold War. In his 72 debate against Noam Chomsky, French intellectual and social theorist Michel Foucault highlighted the significance of Mao Zedong's thought. Both within Europe and the United States, Maoist youth movements merged the traditional Marxism-Leninism of much of the traditional Marxism with the anti-authoritarianism of the New Left. Mao's China also provided an alternative to the increasingly moderate policies of Khrushchev's Soviet Union to intellectuals in the West, who identified with the violent radicalism of Stalinism. Historians and political activists, such as Eugene Genovese, embraced Maoist ideology as an ideological and political model in order to bring about his vision of a communist future. Maoism provided an organizational model for radical student protesters. For example, in addition to the Progressive Labor Party, in which Eugene Genovese participated, radical student activists in the San Francisco Bay Area, Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, used both Maoist ideology and organizational structure as a means to advance their political agenda. Student Bob Avakian, chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party, not only promulgated orthodox Maoism and advocated for radical organizations like the Black Panthers, but he also became the center of a Maoist cult of personality. While Mao Zedong became famous for his Little Red Book, in which he inscribed his thought and teachings, Bob Avakian became noted by his followers for his Little Silver Book, entitled The Bullets, which encapsulated Avakian's thought and teachings. The Cultural Revolution in Maoist China was a radical socialist experiment that appealed to some traditional Marxists as well as the New Left. Because of this, the Cultural Revolution bears historical significance within the mid to late Cold War period of the United States. Furthermore, the Cultural Revolution and Maoist ideology provided not only a forum for debate within traditional Marxism, but also presented itself as an alternative revolutionary model to the Third World, in which the United States was very much engaged throughout the Cold War and beyond. Some intellectuals, as well as radical college students, such as Revolutionary Communist Party Chairman Bob Avakian, viewed the Maoist revolutionary model seen throughout the Cultural Revolution in China as a proper form of revolutionary political action for Third World countries. Therefore, the politics of Maoist ideology was not isolated in mainland China, but rather impacted thought and action in places such as North and Central America during the late 20th century. Maoist revolutionary groups in Latin America, such as Peru's Shining Path, were hotly debated amongst American Marxists throughout the 1980s. For example, in an interview I conducted with Gigi Peterson, a Latin American history professor and artist, for the Trotskyite Freedom Socialist Party newspaper, she recalled her then-husband, a Chilean Marxist, being approached by members of Seattle's Maoist-affiliated Revolutionary Communist Party to praise Shining Path as a praiseworthy revolutionary organization. However, Peterson's husband, a staunch supporter of both the Nicaraguan Sandinistas and Fidel Castro's Cuba, refused to endorse Shining Path due to their excessively violent nature, much to the chagrin of the Maoists who approached him. American Cold War policy leading up to the Vietnam War was overt in its message of militant anti-communism in the form of military involvement in order to contain the perceived communist threat in Asia. Nevertheless, after the political tumult of the 1960s and 70s, American policy in places like Latin America took on a covert character. Radical intellectuals such as Noam Chomsky emphasized how the Reagan administration had been driven underground by societal pressure. notably from the left, in terms of its policy in Latin America throughout the 1980s. According to Chomsky, this was a result of the organizational sophistication of American radicalism throughout the 1980s, thus underscoring the importance of the left on American public opinion at this time. In fact, while many viewed the 1980s as a decade of consensus, intellectuals and activists who challenged American policy in Latin America viewed the decade as being more radical than the 1960s. If this is true, it would indicate that rather than becoming weaker in the 1980s, the American radical left had instead gained momentum, and Reagan administration policies came under harsher scrutiny than the Johnson administration's policies in Vietnam. Intellectuals such as Noam Chomsky spoke frequently on the crises occurring in El Salvador and Nicaragua. Radical political parties, like the Revolutionary Communist Party, dogmatically emphasized the need for violent revolution in Latin American countries, including El Salvador and Peru. Instead, for some social democratic-minded radicals of traditional Marxism, Latin American socialism represented a more complex and potentially humane model for international socialism than the Soviet Union. A sympathetic spectrum of voices that existed within church groups in the United States advocated Latin American political autonomy in the 1980s. Within mass culture, U.S. policy in Latin America was lambasted in films such as Oliver Stone's Salvador, and ultimately the Reagan administration was tried for criminal conspiracies such as Iran-Contra. Clearly, activism in the 1980s, a supposed decade of consensus, impacted mass culture as well as politics. Therefore, as historians, we must understand how the development of traditional Marxism in the 19Cs and 19Cs affected the organized radical atmosphere of the 1980s. Because this project will analyze the intellectual and political responses of the traditional Marxists to crises occurring in socialist countries, it is necessary to define the ideological parameters of this project for the old-school Marxist worldview. When defining traditional Marxism in this project, it is in reference to socialist political thought that stems from the radical political traditions of 19th and early 20th century Europe. This form of thinking is often materialistic and idealistic, and identifies itself as social scientific. Often the radical thought of traditional Marxism viewed history as moving teleologically and progressively to a socialistic stage in which justice would be achieved on a social, political, and industrial level via the hegemonic ascendancy of the working class. While Chomsky described his political views as anti-Bolshevik, he nevertheless stated that his views merged with the 19th century political traditions of anarcho-syndicalism and left-wing Marxism. Chomsky's political maturation occurred in his teenage years while discussing politics in New York with Spanish émigrés coming to the United States after their experience fighting for libertarian socialism in the Spanish Civil War. In the 1960s, members of the New Left sought to differentiate themselves from traditional Marxists, their radical predecessors. While old-school Marxism referred to social scientific political ideology, as well as traditional Bolshevik political parties, the New Left sought to define its radicalism more through a spirit of diffuse existential rebellion. This has been expounded upon by scholars such as Douglas Rosenow in his monograph, The Politics of Authenticity. When referring to socialist countries, I am referring to countries during the Cold War in which socialism was an articulated constitutional legality, or was actively being sought via revolution by a large segment of its population. For the purposes of this project, Vietnam, the People's Republic of China, the Soviet Union, and various Latin American countries throughout the 1980s will be examined. For the component of this project examining American Marxist intelligentsia, the focus will be on individuals such as, but in no way limited to, linguist Noam Chomsky and historian Eugene Genovese. Chomsky is particularly interesting due to his political thought and public persona, which straddle the old and new left. In a 1969 episode of Firing Line entitled Vietnam and the Intellectuals, William F. Buckley referred to Chomsky as one of a half-dozen heroes of the New Left. However, despite Chomsky's criticism of traditional Marxist political parties, his sympathy towards the Viet Cong, and his radical condemnations of American foreign policy, Chomsky's political philosophy was very much that of a pre-Leninist socialist, as opposed to a cohort of New Left leader Herbert Marcuse. When writing about the Soviet Union, Chomsky was consistently critical of Bolshevism and the Soviet state. Chomsky spoke enthusiastically of anarcho-syndicalism as a proper model for a revolutionary post-capitalist order. Furthermore, he readily exalted Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, Karl Marx's rival within the First Communist International, when discussing the politics and history of Marxist-Leninist movements. However, Chomsky also identified with the anti-authoritarian left wing of Marxism, specifically with Marxist thinkers, Rosa Luxemburg and Anton Pannekoek. According to Chomsky, the concept of libertarian socialism exists within the political spectrum, ranging from anarcho-syndicalism to left-wing Marxism. Chomsky used his libertarian socialist worldview as an analytical tool to condemn the Vietnam War as an immoral and destructive continuation of the Truman Doctrine. When interviewed by William F. Buckley, Chomsky was asked to defend socialism to a Czech, referencing the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. Buckley's implication was that socialist revolutions around the world were part and parcel of Soviet imperialism. Chomsky responded that Stalinist and Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe was real and brutal. However, the case of Soviet military imposition of international socialism was at best responsible for 10% of international socialist movements. Chomsky was quick to argue that revolutionary socialist movements in Greece, Latin America, and Vietnam were indigenous movements that existed independent of Soviet military imperialism. In 1971, Chomsky traveled to Holland, where, in a televised debate, he grappled with radical French intellectual superstar Michel Foucault on topics that included linguistics, power, and morality, as well as revolutionary strategy for the proletariat. Records now show that Chomsky's anti-war activism merited his being under surveillance by the CIA. Throughout the 1980s, Chomsky became a principled opponent of the Reagan administration's wars in Latin America. Here, Chomsky advocated in favor of liberation theology, notably in El Salvador, and Sandinista economic policy in Nicaragua. Furthermore, as the Soviet Union faced political instability and economic malaise, Chomsky argued that the decline of the USSR was not a blow against socialism, but rather the collapse of a state institution that was erroneously celebrated as socialist by Soviet and American political propagandists. The Soviet Union had implemented the term socialist to exploit the moral prestige of socialism to cover its crimes. On the other hand, the United States had used socialist to associate the rival ideology of socialism with the poor example of the Bolshevik state. Another notable Marxist intellectual who will be analyzed for the purpose of this project is historian Eugene Genovese. Genovese, an abrasive yet passionately minded Italian-American Stalinist, was expelled from the CPUSA in 1948 for his criticism of party sectarianism. Genovese became known for his academic work on the antebellum South, most notably for his acclaimed 1972 monograph, Roll, Jordan Roll, The World the Slaves Made. Genovese employed the analytical methods of martyred Italian Communist Party leader Antonio Gramsci, particularly Gramsci's dialectical cultural hegemony theory. Genovese's Stalinist sympathies and the historiographical precedents set by 19th and early 20th century Southern apologists George Fitzhugh and U.B. Phillips allowed Genovese to portray the perspective of the antebellum masterclass empathetically. However, Genovese's Marxism caused him to advocate in favor of the slave class, which, he argued, subversively utilized the language of the masterclass in order to carve out a meaningful existence that reflected their own culture, ideals, and interests. In the midst of the Khrushchev era of Soviet leadership, which saw denunciation of Stalin by Soviet political leaders, the Sino-Soviet split, and increasing rapprochement with the United States and the West, Genovese's sympathies gravitated towards the People's Republic of China, and ultimately to the Maoist Progressive Labor Party. In 1965, as the Vietnam War began to rage, Genovese was teaching at Rutgers University. He states, "Once again, our movement, if it is to link up successfully, has no choice but to begin at the level of the movement itself, and not at a level it has not reached because of the uneven development of the class struggle. These movements came into being and became engaged in actions in advance of the radicalization of the industrial workers. Thus, they represent anticipatory movements, but they have an influence of their own on the process that will lead to the eventual radicalization of the major contingents of the working class, and these movements will ultimately converge with them and increase their striking power." The Socialist Workers' Party put forth an interracial presidential ticket in 1968, running Trotskyite journalist Fred Halstead and working-class black militant Paul Boutel. In two March 1971 reports given at the 24th National Convention of the Socialist Workers' Party, the need for the SWP to link with Chicano, black, and women's liberation movements was also articulated by this party in addition to the CPUSA. The desire to incorporate racial and gender radicalism of the New Left was not limited to the Socialist Workers' Party. In a 1966 report given at a meeting of National Communist Leadership, CPUSA head Gus Hall, addressing economic decline in urban centers, stated, "We must dramatically raise the question of black community and working class power as the solution to crises in these cities." In his report to the 22nd National Convention of the Communist Party USA on August 23, 1979, General Shin Dick of the Communist Party USA Hall stated the need of the CPUSA to engage the issues of Afro-American liberation, Chicano-Mexican American liberation, Puerto Rican liberation, Native American liberation, women's equality, and America's youth. Hall went on to discuss the CPUSA's need to address the radical leanings of many American youths. Hall explains, "Our youth are being squeezed by high unemployment and runaway inflation. They are the post-Vietnam generations, and therefore there is a higher anti-imperialist consciousness. The objective situation has never been more primed and ready for the development of an all-youth front that will, in a broad consensus way, be anti-corporate, anti-racist, for jobs and world peace, for an opportunity to make a decent start in life. This potential is reflected in the continuing growth and influence of the party and in the Young Workers' Liberation League." As a result of this concern, during his 1980 and 84 presidential bid, Hall chose well-known Black Panther and feminist Angela Davis as his running mate. Both the SWP and CPUSA were confronted with the unflattering humanitarian crises of international socialist governments of the mid to late Cold War. In a 1968 episode of Firing Line, SPW vice presidential candidate Paul Boutel, an admirer of Castro, was asked if he lauded the political assassinations conducted by the Cuban government. Boutel responded that the Cuban Revolution was a popular revolution, and what was occurring in Cuba was not political assassination, but rather criminals being convicted of their crimes in a manner similar to the Nuremberg trials. Buckley continued questioning the SPW presidential candidate Fred Halstead on Cuban policy, asking his opinion on Castro's not having to face electoral competition in Cuba's Leninist political system. Halstead responded with a standard line used by Western communist parties, namely, that Cuba's political affairs were problematic in his opinion, but were theirs to deal with, while the United States would nevertheless remain a multi-party system under SWP governance. During the 1984 presidential campaign, CPUSA presidential candidate Gus Hall appeared on late-night PBS talk show, Late Night America, with Dennis Holy. On the program, Holy confronted Hall with questions which cast the Soviet Union and, by extension, the Eastern Bloc countries as economically deficient, with populations harassed by secret police. In addition, Holy presented the Soviet war in Afghanistan as an unjust war of aggression. To the first charge of economic malaise, Hall admitted that while the Soviet Union had not matched U.S. living standards, Soviet living standards were rising. He touted Soviet social welfare as more inclusive and secure than its U.S. counterpart. Furthermore, the Soviet state could boast both higher production of steel and sale of technological patents around the globe than the U.S. In terms of personal freedom, Hall's response mirrored that of Halstead's in principle, saying that the communist states of Eastern Europe were not perfect. Nonetheless, he believed the West's criticisms of life under Soviet-style communism to be exaggerated. Furthermore, the political and legal culture of Eastern Europe should not reflect on the CPUSA's political program for the U.S., which promised the continuation of the U.S. cultural traditions of multi-party politics and individual freedom. In response to the Soviet-Afghan War, Hall found himself ironically mirroring the rhetoric of Vietnam War supporters like Buckley, in that the USSR's presence in Afghanistan, while unfortunate, was invited by the legitimate Afghan government. However, Hall did admit that the Soviet military presence was not purely altruistic. In order to understand the opinion of the American Marxist rank and file during the period discussed in this project, more archival research needs to be conducted. However, an examination of the historiography of American Marxism provides valuable information concerning the multi-directional dynamics of these movements. Historians have written sporadically on the topic of American Marxism, often concentrating on the early to mid-20th century, much of which is focused on the history of the Soviet-linked CPUSA. These monographs range from viewing American communism as a totalitarian duping by Moscow to apologia written by American communists, to ultimately viewing American communism as a unique and multifaceted language of dissent of various groups during the early 20th century. Historian Theodore Draper's work on the CPUSA established a view of American communists as either totalitarian functionaries or naive dupes of Soviet political interests. His 1907 monograph, The Roots of American Communism, argues that socialistically inclined thinkers' attraction to Marxism-Leninism ultimately ensnared them in a web of indoctrination and subordination to the leadership of the Soviet Union. For Draper, CPUSA members were primarily dupes of Soviet manipulation, stemming from the authoritarian nature of Marxist-Leninist ideology. To the extent that the CPUSA functioned as an instrument of democratic grassroots sentiment, it was due to Moscow's managerial oversight, according to Draper, as opposed to the nature of communist ideological and political structure. Existing at the other end of the political and historiographical spectrum is communist apologia. William Z. Foster's 1952 monograph, History of the Communist Party of the United States, is a thorough history of the CPUSA with multiple references to early American Marxism. In essence, Foster creates a sweeping narrative of mass-based socialist sentiment in the United States, beginning with the American Revolution and culminating in the CPUSA being battered by McCarthyist persecution, but dutifully leading America to its communist destiny. Foster's tone and content are overtly Stalinist. In describing the early political dynamics of Soviet Russia, which would serve as an inspiration for the CPUSA, Foster writes, Trotskyism, which Lenin had long fought, had become a malignant pest in the Soviet Union. The Soviet people wanted none of Trotsky's destructive program. The brilliant Stalin proved in theory that it was possible to build socialism in one country, and that the Communist Party's policies were leading precisely to that goal. Another method of historical and political apologia, utilized in histories of the CPUSA and SWP, is to compile party reports, speeches, and essays, etc., around a topic or set of topics. Often these works include flattering introductions to the legacies and goals of said parties. Such works include Strategy for the 70s, Documents of the Socialist Workers' Party in 1972, The Founding of the Socialist Workers' Party, Minutes and Resolutions 1938, 39, 1982, and Gus Hall's compilations such as Basics 1980 and Working Class USA 1908. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, the histories written on American Marxism, as it pertained to traditional Marxism, were sparse. Studies were largely confined to looking at how CPUSA members at the grassroots level uniquely interpreted Stalinist ideology and the party line throughout the 1920s and 30s. Such works include Robin D.G. Kelly's study of the Alabama branch of the CPUSA in the 1930s, Hammer and Hoe, 1990. In addition, Randy Storch's Red Chicago, 2007, focuses on popular front strategies utilized by the CPUSA in late 1920s Chicago. The historiography of the New Left followed similar trends to studies of traditional Marxism, seeing early works either damning or praising the movement. However, as the 1990s progressed, less politically motivated analysis arose. As an example of this later trend, Douglas Rosano's Politics of Authenticity, 1998, examines how the Texas New Left's political radicalism stemmed from a dissatisfaction with liberal consumerism, the influence of Christian idealism, and ultimately the embracing of existentialist philosophy, despite the general historiographical neglect of traditional Marxism. Historians Aaron J. Leonard and Conor A. Gallagher were able to write an insightful monograph on Maoism in the United States entitled Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists, the Revolutionary Union, Revolutionary Communist Party, 1968 to 1980. Leonard and Gallagher examined the origins of the Revolutionary Union and Revolutionary Communist Party, their doctrines, political strategies, political schisms, and their infiltration by the FBI. The authors argue that, despite lacking a large electoral base, the Revolutionary Union and Revolutionary Communist Party's activism, politics, and strategies alarmed the FBI. In addition, the SDS's radical legacy continued well into the 1980s via Maoist political parties. Intellectual histories on American Marxism during the mid to late Cold War period are limited. Dutch-American studies scholar Adrianus Arnaldus Maria van der Linden's monograph, A Revolt Against Liberalism, American Radical Historians, 1960, discusses the motivations, political agendas, scholarship, and worldviews of Cold War-era radical historians. Van der Linden's study does not focus solely on American Marxism. However, Eugene Genovese's work, scholarly debates, and worldview are mentioned in this text. If one must assess the value of writing on Cold War American Marxist thought and action, one can look to the principles of historiographical philosophy and the actions of state leaders. Regardless of a historian's focus, the history of ideas is in and of itself viewable. This has been understood by honored historians of colonial America, such as Perry Miller, who examined the Puritan mind, as well as Gordon Wood, who studied the political rhetoric of the Founding Fathers. Furthermore, social historians have long emphasized the importance of finding and understanding the perspectives of those considered insignificant or overlooked by their historiographical predecessors. While the American Marxism of the old school held less resonance with a plurality of Americans during the Cold War, as opposed to during the Great Depression, there were, nevertheless, individuals and political institutions within the United States that took the ideas of Marxism seriously both as a philosophical worldview and as a political program to improve the United States on moral and political levels. Furthermore, the existence of Marxist thinkers in the United States drew the ire of the lower and upper echelons of the U.S. government in the form of arrests, surveillance, and political condemnations. It is my hope that the issues discussed in this proposal can be expanded upon in order to build a meaningful prospectus and dissertation project. The intermingling of American Marxist intellectual history and international socialist crises has the potential to shed light on the historiographically neglected topic of Cold War American Marxism, an area of interest to those seeking to understand a provocative spectrum of radicalism in the American mind. Bibliography. Avakian Bob. Bullets. From the writings, speeches, and interviews of Bob Avakian, chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party, RCP Publications, Chicago, 1985. Chomsky, Noam, and Michel Foucault. Debate on Human Nature. The New Press, 1971-2006. Chomsky, Noam. Socialism versus the Soviet Union. Our Generation, Spring-Summer, 1986. http w.chomsky info. Articles on Chomsky. Noam. Debate with John Silber. Channel 986. H2 Chomsky info. Debates on 1980 video clip. YouTube.com. Watch. IXY Chomsky interview with James Peck in the Chomsky Reader. Pantheon Books, New York. Chomsky, Manufacturing Consent, the Political Economy of the Mass Media lecture at the University of Wisconsin. In 89. Draper, Theodore, The Roots of American Communism. Octagon Books, 1957. Foster, William Z. History of the Communist Party of the United States. International Publishers, 1952. Genovese, Eugene. The Crisis in the World Communist Movement. Marxist-Leninist Quarterly. Volume I, Number 2, no date, 1963. Marxists Org. History, Errol, Periodicals. MLQ, US 123. HTM, Genovese, Eugene, and Ronald Radash. An interview with Eugene Genovese, The Rise of a Marxist Historian. Change, Volume 10. Number 10. November 1978. Genovese, Eugene. The Southern Front, History in Politics and Culture War. Columbus, University of Missouri Press, 1995, pp. 293, Genovese, Eugene. Quoted by Sanford Pinkster, Can Southern Conservatives Rise Again? Book review of Genovese's The Southern Tradition. The Achievement and Limitations of an American Conservatism, http via online. Can Southern Conservatism Rise Again? Hall, Gus. Labor Up Front. In the People's Fight Against Crisis. International Publishers, 1979. Hall, Gus. Interviewed by Dennis Holy on Late Night America. 84. YouTube.com watch. VUBK Goud ZBQ. Hall, Gus. Working Class. International Publishers, New York, 1987. Hall, Gus. Angela Davis. 1984 Presidential Campaign Video. YouTube.com watch. V. J. Few. Harmon. Christopher C. Terrorism Today. Wrote Ledge, 2007. Kane Alex. CIA targeted Noam Chomsky. Documents reveal. HT Alternate Org. Civil Liberties. CIA spied Noam Chomsky. Leonard. Aaron J. Connor. A. Gallagher. Heavy Radicals. The FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists. The Revolutionary Union. Revolutionary Communist Party. 1968-1980. Zero Books. Washington, USA. Winchester. UK. 2014. Max Elbaum. Maoism in the United States. Encyclopedia of the American Left. Second edition. HTW Marxists Org. History. Errol. M1 Maoism Us. HTM. Noam Chomsky. Interview with Bill Moyers. Improved quality. Part 1. HTeeps.youtube.com. Watch. VZUCF. E. Passeri. Noel. Interview with Gigi Peterson. January 2015. Passeri. Noam Chomsky. Interview conducted February 17, 2015. Revolutionary Strategy for the 70s. Documents of the Socialist Workers' Party. Pathfinder Press. 1971. Roper. John Herbert. Marxing through Georgia, Eugene Genovese, in Radical Historiography for the Region. The Southern Front, History and Politics in the Cultural War by Eugene Dominic Genovese. The Georgia Historical Quarterly, Volume 80, Number 1. Spring 1996. Rossino Douglas. The Politics of Authenticity. Liberalism, Christianity, and the New Left in America. Columbia University Press, 1998. Shepard, Barry et al. A Revolutionary Strategy for the 70s. Documents of the Socialist Workers' Party. Pathfinder Press, New York, 1972. Socialist Workers' Party. Presidential candidates Fred Halstead and Paul Boutel interviewed on Firing Line, 1968. http vimeo.com 1861169. Van der Linden, AAM. A Revolt Against Liberalism. American Radical Historians, 1959-1976. Amsterdam, Atlanta, 1990s.